Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. It's a couple minutes after 1 o'clock, so I'm going to get started. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Caitlin Clarkson-Pereira, and I'm the Executive Director of GVPedia. And thank you again for taking the time to join us for this important Zoom call so we can discuss the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms with our special guest, Mark Jones. So just a few housekeeping items before we begin. First, we are recording the session. All guests here are on mute, and some of you did submit questions in the RSVP form, and if there are any others that come up, that's fine. Just put them in the chat box for us as we go through the presentation, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can at the end. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce you to Devin Hughes, who is the founder of GVPedia. But first, I just wanted to give a brief introduction as to who we are. GVPedia is a comprehensive resource providing public access to our gun safety database, which is the largest in existence, including over 1,000 academic studies, and access to GVP University, which is a repository of white papers and fact sheets about gun violence. Both the database and the university are easily searchable by subject matter and provide excellent resources and education and advocacy purposes. GVP University is now also the home to our Facts About Firearms policy initiative. So again, we're super thankful to have Mark Jones joining us today. He is a firearms policy and regulation expert and consultant whose clients include national gun violence prevention groups, law enforcement organizations, print and broadcast media outlets, and academic organizations. And Mr. Jones retired from a 40-year career that included 20 years as an ATF special agent, as well as several years in the private sector and the nonprofit world. So now I'm going to turn this conversation over to Devin and to Mark Jones.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thank all of you for being here, especially you, Mark. Welcome to GVPedia Explorers.
Keep the bar low, Devin, please.
So I think we should, like our previous conversations, talk for about 30 or so minutes and then open it up for audience questions. Some of you have already submitted excellent questions, and I'll try to incorporate those in with some of the questions I had. And then if any questions pop up in chat during, I'll try to get to those or save them for the question and answer session, depending on what the question looks like. So I think just to start off, like, what is the ATF? What do they do, and particularly around the subject of firearms? Why is the ATF so important? You're back on mute, Mark, somehow.
Not anymore. Okay, so you're asking me that question.
Yes.
Just want to make sure. So ATF was originally a Treasury Department agency. It started off its sort of modern life in as a unit within the Internal Revenue Service, the Tobacco Tax Division of the Internal Revenue Service. In 1972, they were created as a full bureau, no longer just a unit, but a component of the Internal Revenue Service. They derived their authority from taxation and interstate commerce, of movement of these commodities, particularly firearms, which is what we're talking about. All its enforcement and regulatory authority come from basically the tax law and the Gun Control Act, now Gun Control Act of 1968, and the National Firearms Act of 1934. So you can see we're going way back into the 20th century for this agency that's now in the 21st century, and that's going to be a constant rub on why ATF doesn't do the things it's supposed to do. Largely because it's proscribed from doing them by the people that told it it's supposed to do it in the first place, if that makes any sense at all. I know it's very convoluted. In about 2003, ATF was moved to the Justice Department. They split off the regulatory components for alcohol and tobacco. ATF retained some enforcement authority for tobacco violations, but all of the taxing and collecting of taxes of those things went to the Trade and Tax Bureau, a newly created bureau when they split ATF off from the Treasury Department. So now in 2021, ATF's focus is largely on the firearms industry and the explosives industry. And there's some mandates that they have to do things for the explosives industry that don't exist for the firearms industry, that again impact on why they can't regulate the firearms industry as well as they should.
So it sounds like the ATF doesn't have all that many issues with like explosives. So what all has Congress and legislators done over the past couple decades or so to really cripple the ATF in terms of doing its job?
Yeah.
Regulating firearms.
Well, Devin, that's a really good question. I have to say that ATF started off crippled as a bureau. And the Gun Control Act of 1968 was written largely by the firearms industry. So there are things in it that protect the industry members, like an evidentiary standard for criminal violations that's higher than other people. So a federal firearms dealer has to not only know that the thing that they're doing is wrong, but they have to actually have set out to violate the law to do it. And that makes it a very difficult standard to prove when it's very clear. Well, never mind, I'm getting off track. The industry and Congress have hobbled ATF by, well, first and foremost, they've kept the Bureau in a very weakened position versus other federal law enforcement agencies. The Bureau started off in 72 with about 2,500 special agents and about just under 900 regulatory inspectors and then support staff. And in 2021, ATF has about 2,500 special agents and fewer inspectors than they actually had in 1972. And if you compare that to, say, the Drug Enforcement Administration or the US Marshals Service or the FBI or the Bureau of Prisons or the Border Patrol or any other federal law enforcement entity, ATF is exactly the same demographically from a numbers of bodies and the work they can actually do as they were in 1972. Now, this also in the face of huge increases in applications for federal firearms licenses, National Firearms Act, firearms like silencers and machine guns and short shotguns, things like that. So that's one thing. Another thing that's that started in the 90s, Congress started passing appropriations riders on ATF's budget and mandating what they could and could not do with their appropriated funds. And that sounds all in the weeds, but what it really means is Congress told ATF, okay, here's your job. Enforce the Gun Control Act of 1968, regulate the firearms industry, regulate all these industries. And while you're doing that, the firearms industry, we're going to make sure that you don't have the capacity to use your computers now to document your work. Instead, you must rely on paper and pencil, this is the gospel. They're using the Firearms Tracing Center at ATF is mandated to never digitize any incoming records from out of business dealers. And if I tell you that 2 fully loaded 18-wheel tractor trailers arrive at the National Tracing Center every week or 10 days filled with paper records from out of business dealers, that may be an understatement, just the sheer numbers. There's so much of information available about how ATF has been beggared by Congress that told it to do a job and then say, okay, but we're not going to give you the tools to do it. So lack of personnel, lack of adequate funding, riders on their appropriations say they can't do any of these things. They really can't. They're just stuff that ATF agents are not allowed to do because the industry thinks it's too much of a risk of a national registration scheme, which according to the industry would then lead us to have ATF go knocking on everybody's door to confiscate their guns. This is patently ridiculous. I'm telling you, as someone who worked in the Bureau for 20 years, I know it's impossible, just physically impossible. We're approaching 400 million guns in this country in private hands, not even including law enforcement or military, 400 million guns in private hands in this country. And you've got 2,500 ATF agents. And one more thing, last thing I swear, their budget, their appropriations all have a phrase attached to them that says no other agency or they're not allowed to use ATF's appropriated funds to have another agency do their work, and no other agency can do that work except ATF. They put it right in ATF's. So all this talk about merging ATF with DEA or FBI or giving some of this responsibility to FBI, it can't happen because Congress has said, no, we want ATF basically just the way it was in 1972. And from my perspective, what Congress and what the industry wants and Congress has mandated is that ATF be there as a regulatory stalking horse. So they can say, look, we're being regulated, but at the same, and when something goes wrong, they're there to be beaten up. Look how bad ATF is. Look, they're not enforcing the laws on the books. Look how awful they are. But they don't want any improvement. None of the industry folks wants to have a better regulatory and enforcement scheme. They like things just the way they are. And based on that, at least in part, we're losing about 40,000 Americans a year to gun violence, to suicides and homicides and accidental shootings. Excuse me while I quiet my dog. So that was a good ending to that diatribe.
So kind of on that note, quick follow-up question. What does the ATF do particularly well with the resources it has at the moment? Because like there are certain things where it seems like the ATF is doing its job correctly, even though it's being hobbled by being forced to be before computers were invented and such.
Yeah. ATF is a really, really fine law enforcement agency. As a bureau, ATF, generally speaking, puts more people in jail, makes more arrests, seizes more property than other agencies. It's been the way, at least it was that way. I haven't tracked those numbers for quite a while, but for my entire pendency at the bureau, my entire time there, ATF led the federal law enforcement by weight, if you understand. Fewer agents, fewer resources, and they were punching way above their weight as far as outputs, what we think of as outputs, right? The widgets, the things that we, defendants, cases, convictions, seizures, monetary asset seized, things like that. ATF, for its size, led the federal government over and over again. And it's not an accident. The Bureau has cultivated creativity and individual initiative in its agents because it's so small. I mean, the word I got when I started with ATF in 1991 was, here's your badge, here's your gun, here's your car, go out and form a task force someplace. And that's how ATF works. They connect with state and local partners as part of the Safe Streets Act, which was part of the Gun Control Act of '68. Their job is largely to help local law enforcement stop guns from getting in the wrong hands and that kind of thing. And ATF is superb at that. Absolutely superb. They do partnership, they do task forces, probably as well or better than any other federal law enforcement agency. So with limited resources, the American people get a really fine enforcement agency. Sadly, what they don't get is a regulatory agency, which is the other half of what ATF is supposed to do. And on the firearms side, it's just debilitated.
Yeah, so one of my favorite regulatory enforcement stories with the ATF, it was written up in the Trace several years ago. It was talking about Arkansas. In 2014, Arkansas had reported around 300 guns lost or stolen from licensed dealers for the entire state that year. The ATF got a tip the following year in 2015 that like, hey, there's this one gun store that might be having some bad practices. You guys should probably check this out. And so the ATF investigated this one store, and lo and behold, all these guns were all of a sudden lost or stolen. The store had no clue what happened to them. So for the entire state, the number of lost or stolen guns went from 300 to 3,000 due to a single store being audited that year. And that leads to another question, which is, I believe the figure that's frequently cited is around 7% of federally licensed dealers each year are audited. Yet we do know that many federally licensed dealers are often like some dude who likes to sell guns in his spare time, and so he got the license just, I guess, to make things easier for himself at some point. So is that 7% all a lot of larger gun dealers, and so they're capturing most of where the action is, or is the 7% kind of a true figure in terms of like they're only auditing 7% of the people who need to be audited each year, and lots of gun stores are going through the cracks.
Yeah. Okay, so it's kind of a big question. ATF in its history has never achieved even its most modest goals of inspecting firearms dealers. When they first started off, and I don't think through the years they've achieved anything more than about 11 or 12%. I think one year they might have hit 19% of all the gun dealers. It's not really getting to your question, what's the reason behind this? My understanding is that the 7% figure relates to the pandemic year. And so that, we'll give them a pass on the pandemic year, but the 40 or so years before that, ATF regulatory side of the house prioritizes the work differently depending on sort of who's in charge of the Bureau for that period of time. And for a while in the 90s, there was this real move to try to move what you're talking about, small kitchen table dealers, people who have a license to buy and sell guns for themselves and maybe their friends. They make a few sales a year, but largely they get the license just so they can save money on their own guns. And a lot of times to avoid scrutiny, it's easier to get a firearm. I mean, you can get them through the mail if you're a licensed dealer. So these kitchen table dealers, they don't get inspected very often, but neither do the big dealers. I mean, ATF has so few inspectors that if it's Walmart's turn, the Bureau has to shut down all other inspections so that Walmart can get inspected, or largely all other inspections. Pick another huge firearms retailer. I don't know, you name one, it's going to be the same thing. If it's their turn that year, everybody else has to wait. And so, they get their inspections, and they do prioritize inspections for dealers that have a lot of crime guns, a lot of guns traced back to them. But at the same time, it's really shown that just because a dealer has many traces doesn't mean they're necessarily doing anything wrong. It's proximity and volume a lot of times. Proximity to a market. Rialco in suburban Washington, D.C. and Maryland has been this way for decades, where they're the single largest FFL in the Washington, D.C. metro for firearms recoveries. They've had scrutiny on them. I mean, ATF practically had an agent parked or an inspector parked in the store, and still they can't revoke their license. They're not doing anything wrong. It's the violation or the volume of the sales. Similarly to Chuck's in Chicago, where I came from.
Mark, you still there? Looks like Mark might have dropped for a moment. Oh, you back? You're back on mute.
There. The ATF inspection program suffers largely because it's not robust. They don't have enough inspectors. It says my internet connection is unstable. That's why. They just don't have the bodies to do the work, Devin. And they've never been given it. And there's an in the weeds aspect to this that I'm only going to touch on. And that is, there has been an internal battle between inspectors and agents for decades, and the agents won after Waco. So the work of the agents has been emphasized. The work of the inspectors has been de-emphasized, I guess, by internal politics. And so for a variety of reasons, mainly that they're not funded properly and Congress doesn't esteem the idea of a robust regulatory program for the firearms industry. ATF, I mean, the 7%, it's definitely not because they're hitting all the high volume or the high volume folks. It's just because they don't have the people to do it. Just no matter what excuse they may give as a bureau.
Yes. And you mentioned earlier about like dealers being just in proximity and volume, and that often driving crime guns basically coming from those stores, not necessarily the fault of the stores themselves in terms of prescribed practices, but just because they're in a certain place. And there's a statistic often pointed out by our side of the issue where it's like 5% of gun dealers are responsible for 90% of crime guns. And so it kind of goes along with the inspection question in terms of like, is that 5% just the 5% largest stores and then that are selling 90% of the guns, therefore 90% of the crime guns are coming from them just due to the basic math of them selling lots of guns? And kind of a follow-up to that large question I'm seeing in chat from Tom Mauser is how often are really bad, irresponsible gun dealers shut down even temporarily?
Yeah. Well, I don't know how much you or any of the folks that are on this call have followed the Trace and the Everytown lawsuit that resulted in the Everytown FOIA rather, that resulted in the release of 2 years of ATF inspection reports and issued violations. I've reviewed many of those reports. It shows that currently ATF doesn't shut down very many, a very small percentage of dealers ever are even recommended to be revoked. And it seems as if the current practice is for the executive in the field division, the one who's the final, like the deciding official on whether someone gets a revocation or a warning letter or a warning conference or nothing at all. Those folks have, at least for that 2-year period, it's very clear that recommendations for more severe sanctions for bad gun dealing have been mitigated over and over again by the director of industry operations in the field divisions or by headquarters, by ATF headquarters. In other words, inspectors go and find actual criminal violations. And this is the truth. I've read the reports. I can see them. Real criminal activity. And they recommend a revocation and you send it over to criminal for further follow-up, and it ends up, they get a warning letter or a warning conference that's mandated by the executive that says, no, that's too harsh. And it seems from, I've read a section or a spattering of 2 years of reports, but all the ones I read had that same sort of, Devin, the inspector, says, this place is terrible and it needs to be shut down. And Penny, the area supervisor, says, yeah, I agree, that should be shut down. And then Mark, the director of industry operations, says, no, that's way too harsh. This isn't that big of a deal. We're going to have a warning conference and get them back on track. I don't know. I haven't seen what ATF has said in response to this, although I know with personal certainty that the former director, Regina Lombardo, has those things in her hand, or had those things in her hand before she retired. The current acting director, whoever that happens to be, has them and knows this. And if David Chipman is confirmed as the director, he knows these things. So the Bureau knows that they're doing this. It's not like there's some like rogue field division that's cutting all the firearms dealers a break. This seems to be a national Bureau policy directive to say, we're gonna try to like not run dealers out of business. We're gonna try to, and part of it, Devin, the agency is supposed to regulate and help firearms dealers do business correctly and take them out of business when they don't. And they're very much emphasizing the first part and kind of ignoring the second part. That's my observation on that. Does that answer the question sufficiently?
Yes. Yeah. And kind of as a follow-up to that, like, because oftentimes we hear from the gun industry and like people who are sympathetic to gun dealers, it's like, oh, you have these big bad ATF agents come in and they found you misspelled a single word or abbreviated something, but like the state name rather than spelling it out on the form. Every single one of those cases is a violation, and that's how you get like the 5,000 different violations from a single gun seller. And therefore the ATF's just looking for any excuse to run these poor innocent gun dealers out of business. So sure. How's that match with reality?
Yeah, it doesn't match up at all. Well, okay, I take that back. There's a grain of truth in that when I was still with the ATF, so I left it at the very beginning of 2012. So that tells you how long I've been gone. While I was there, I believe I was still a street agent. So this is a while ago. ATF inspectors were writing up violations for people putting a Y instead of yes, or an N instead of no in the questions that someone answers on the 4473, the yellow sheet, right? And so there was a hue and cry about that, and they adjusted the policy so that's no longer a violation. But that was the genesis of what you're talking about. That specific story is the genesis of that. That ATF was going through this convolution of, you know, some inspectors are saying that's a violation and some aren't. So they've standardized that policy, and that's not. And in fact, all of those things, they go and recommend to the dealer. They say to them, you should do it this way or you should do it that way, but don't be inconsistent with that. And the bottom line is the ATF people can't actually mandate how a gun dealer does business. They can just go in and review their previous business practices. So things like that, I mean, that's just more industry drivel to try to support their weak argument that we don't need a better ATF.
And kind of going on along with that, like there's an idea kind of in the general public that it's like, oh, the ATF's kind of like the Consumer Product Safety Commission, where like they're just making sure to regulate everything, keep everything safe, and like everything's just fine in that front. And so does the ATF operate in any way like that? And are guns as regulated as other consumer goods like teddy bears, basically?
You know, it's really interesting that you say that. When I was working with the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence, they had a teddy bear gun created. I don't know if you remember that. They created a teddy bear gun. It would shoot and everything else, but it looked like a teddy bear. Guns are not consumer products. They're really not. They're not regulated in any meaningful way by anybody. I'll point to the Remington lawsuit. They had a product liability problem with the safety on their Model 700, an ubiquitous bolt action hunting rifle that seemed like many of them, when you took the safety off, would fire. And so Remington tried to fix it and tried to fix it and tried to fix it. And they did all kinds of stuff, but there was never a product recall. And it was only when they had, I want to say, several thousand complaints and deaths and injuries from this particular malfunction that they pulled the rifle and they started doing replacements. Like they made announcements. It's been the same way with many gun companies over the course of time. Taurus had an issue like that. Bottom line is no. Consumer Product Safety Commission is specifically prohibited from regulating firearms. If you look in their approach language, firearms are off the table for them. And ATF regulates the commerce in firearms, but not the firearms themselves. So even junk guns that you don't see very often in the market any longer, like High Points and Jennings Bricos and things like that are made of zinc and will shoot 5 times and explode, or, really poorly designed products. Consumers don't really have much of a resource to be able to go after a company that does something wrong, that creates a bad product. So no, the answer is no. They're not regulated like any other consumer product. They're not regulated. Frankly, they're not regulated. They're very lightly regulated, if anything. Let's just say that.
Yeah, so I'm going to open it up to audience questions here shortly, kind of combining 2 or 3 questions that we've received. There's kind of like, what can we do to like advocate for the ATF or help the ATF? And given just how hobbled the ATF is currently in recognizing that reality, is there anything that states specifically can do to like hold firearms dealers accountable or kind of lift some of the weight that ATF simply isn't able to carry at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. The first part of the question, what can we do? What can individuals do? The most important thing you can do is let your elected representatives know how you feel about this stuff. I mean, you have to be persistent. You have to be a gadfly. You have to, call that senator, even if you dislike that senator enormously and disagree with their politics altogether and think you're not going to be doing any good. They really do count the calls. They really do count the emails and the texts and stuff. And if you call them and express your displeasure with the fact that you're paying for a bureau that doesn't actually get to do its work, and that the money that the $1.2 billion that we're spending on that bureau is, a lot of it is just wasted. They may start to pay attention. There's a shift. We've all seen a shift in this in our country, right? We're more and more of us are paying attention to this, and are interested in stopping the carnage in our streets. The second thing, I think, the second part of your question is, what can states do? And states can do things to pick up the weight. It's a touchy proposition, but the state of Illinois recently, within the last 2 years, passed gun dealer regulation law that is a model for the country. It takes all, okay, so ATF produces a document for federal firearms licensees that says recommended best practices. And so there's this range, and you can find it on their website. They know what they're supposed to do, but they're not allowed to mandate it. Illinois adopted all those best practices as mandatory practices. So now the Illinois State Police have the capacity to go to a dealer that's getting a lot of traces and say, okay, we're going to do a quarterly audit on your store. We're going to start coming in and making sure all your guns are there every quarter. They've got a variety of different things. In other words, ATF won't issue a license to a dealer if they're not going to do business in accordance with state law. If state law says you must adhere to these rules if you're going to be a gun dealer, they have to do it. And so Illinois, in the next couple of years, should really have a handle on, sort of which are good and bad gun dealers, and where to put their focus. The problem comes with, it's the same problem that ATF has: appropriated funds. States don't have any more money than the government. In fact, way less. The state police in Illinois are extremely poorly funded. I mean, you can speed with impunity in Illinois. In most places, you're not going to ever see a trooper. They just don't have the bodies any longer. So the complaint that we got when we were trying to get this law enacted in Illinois from the gun people was, well, how are you going to do this? The state police don't have any money to do this. They're not even, like, they didn't spend all of their appropriated funds on the gun stuff they were supposed to do the previous year. That's a hard argument to refute sometimes. And I think the real rub is we have to do better at this. And if the federal government isn't going to do it, then our states, where we really do have more agency in getting things done, should start to look at regulating their gun dealers in a way that's going to be helpful to doing things with, in accordance with what ATF does, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that kind of raises another point that I saw, I believe it was in the trace, again, where like there's actual concerns that, given that the Biden administration, this kind of opening up the field of politics a bit, was looking at regulating stabilizing braces. Mm-hmm. And another quick tangent on that. So I was at the NRA convention back in 2018 and got to see their mile long of guns. And there was a booth dedicated to short barrel rifles, where like, no, these weren't short barrel rifles, but they were pistols with a stabilizing brace, or like a rifle, but where like all the action was moved to the back, like bullpup firearms and stuff. And like I've heard gun lobbyists talk about like, oh, these are to help poor disabled people to be able to fire their guns and stuff. And I saw none of that at this booth. In fact, the booth was like, because I was like, isn't that like a short barreled rifle? And they're like, no, it's not. And kind of smirking while doing it. It's like, and this is the best way you can get around these regulations. But now that the Biden administration is finally noticing like, hey, there's an issue here, that the ATF really doesn't have the capacity to handle that sort of workload, and that like, while trying to do the right thing on these sort of firearms, it's just dumping more work on the ATF that the ATF's not going to be able to handle. So can you see a risk there, and like where a good idea could potentially lead to even further problems for us?
Absolutely. And I'm going to circle back to one of the first things I said. The Bureau is underfunded and under-resourced at the end. They don't have the bodies and they don't have the resources to do the current work that they have to do. They've been the National Firearms Act branch, the imports folks, all of the regulatory side of the house that's been so de-emphasized over the year, are now struggling to keep up with this massive demand. I mean, at the beginning of the Trump administration, well, actually starting in 2012, the applications for firearm suppressors, silencers, went through the roof. They just started climbing. And the Bureau hasn't been able to keep up. They've been under merciless criticism for their inability to keep up with this backlog. But the issue remains the same. They could do this if they were properly resourced, or if they could spread the work around to another bureau. DEA, for instance, has a huge regulatory component. They've been a regulatory enforcement agency, just like ATF. You could conceivably put that work together. We're de-emphasizing the war on drugs in a big way. We're not doing things the same way we did there. It would be seems to me fairly easy for Congress to merge all those. They're both justice agencies, merge them into a vice agency, guns, firearms, drugs, whatever, but get them in one place, and you could have that work done. Or you could start to plus up the agency year at a time, get them up to where they're supposed to be. There's no simple answer, but the industry has run rampant since the very beginning. They talk and act as if they're, under the oppressive boot of the fascists, but what they are is doing exactly what they want to do and figuring out ways to get around these regulations with, pistol braces to make pistols short barrel rifles, or firearms to make a short barrel shotgun into a firearm, not a shotgun, through a semantic, I don't want to say loophole, because it's in the law. It says why they're doing this. And if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, there are a couple of firearms. One is the Mossberg Shockwave 590. That's a short barreled shotgun that should be regulated as a short barrel shotgun, but is instead classified as a firearm, because Mossberg told ATF they never, excuse me, I got an appliance guy showing up. I'm trying to direct him where I'm going, where he's going. They should be regulated under the NFA as a short barrel shotgun, but the manufacturer says, no, we never meant to have it fired from the shoulder, so it's not a shotgun, it's a firearm. It's the most ridiculous semantic BS that I can think of, but the industry's gotten away with it. And when you're talking about the pistol braces, or the wrist braces, the original concept for that was for a returning veteran who was disabled and couldn't shoot anymore with one hand, so they created this pistol brace for him. Well, as soon as they did that, I mean, when you look at the history of that, there's a letter that this manufacturer, SB Tactical, put out to his customers, say, well, I can't believe that ATF approved this, but they did, so everybody come and get it. And I mean, that's only just a little bit of exaggeration, just a tiny little bit. That's kind of how it works. It started before the Trump administration. And when the Trump administration came in, they opened the door on this. If you're familiar with that Ron Turk letter, an executive at ATF wrote a white paper that talked about how many regulations they could get rid of. My guess is because he wanted to be in accord with the administration to try to do better for the agency with budgets and things. But what he really did was he just handed the firearms industry another sort of carte blanche. Go make what you want, and we'll turn our heads from it.
Right. Yeah, and as we're kind of on the subject of politics, there's another question from audience member where did you notice a difference in the robustness of ATF's enforcement and regulatory work between Democratic and Republican administrations? Even though it's intentionally a handcuff agency, did you notice it being more handcuffed by Republicans, or say, Trump, Bush versus Clinton, Obama sort of situation?
I know you're going to probably find this shocking, but ATF always does better under Republicans as a bureau. Law and order, crime and punishment, those things get funding from Republican administrations. The Clinton administration proposed to take away 25% of ATF's firearms budget following Waco, because I believe they were trying to curry favor with the industry and say, okay, we're going to do something about this rogue federal agency. And so they proposed to take away basically the entire firearms enforcement program. because it was duplicative of state and local work. That was the excuse. ATF created a new position to handle that work and dodged that, pardon the pun, dodged that bullet. But yeah, the Republicans so far have treated ATF better budget-wise than the Democrats generally did. I mean, President Obama was on the board of the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence when he was a state senator. He knew exactly what was going on. He was briefed over and over again about all the stuff we're talking about that was existent at the time he was going to run. He was a state senator, a US senator, and then ran for president. And his administration did nothing in the first term, and very little, only executive orders in the second term. It's not necessarily a criticism of the Obama administration. It's just the reality. So, don't vote Republican to do it better for ATF, is my opinion. But at the same time, recognize that we have to do better. Look, Harry Reid, you recall Harry Reid was the Speaker of the House, was he not? Was he? No, yes. He's Speaker of the House, yeah? No, he was a Senate leader. Senate leader. Harry Reid took as much money from the NRA as many of the Republicans. There's been a lot to go around on the Dem side as far as keeping ATF a hobbled, weakened agency. So just for that, for what that's worth, know that.
So how do you think that most of the rank and file at the ATF is going to react to David Chipman if he gets through the confirmation process? Because like I've heard stuff from like the Republican side where it's like, oh, the ATF's like up in arms about like how dare they put this rabid gun lobbyist or gun violence prevention lobbyist in charge, and like all these scaremongering tactics. But do you have a sense of like on the actual ground, like how they'll react?
Yeah, I do. My 20 years in the Bureau, I had 5 or 6 directors, and I couldn't have given a fig who was really leading the charge until they do something stupid or they do something great. Seriously, rank and file folks are so far removed from the executive staff and the headquarters. They really, it's like, what do they want us to do? Okay, that's what we're going to do, by and large. David Chipman retired in 2012. That's almost 10 years. I'll pretty much guarantee there's not a street agent that knows him or has even seen him in person up till now. And the folks that are at the executive level that do know him, I honestly don't think there are very many folks that are in the Bureau now that actually worked with him. It just turns over. It turns over very fast. I know very few people, honestly, that are still working agents at ATF, and I've only been retired 10 years. So I think the rank and file will react to David Chipman based on his actions as the director. And I think if he comes in and does the right thing by the Bureau, and he's fighting for the Bureau, and he was an agent. Look, David is a close friend of mine. He and I talk about these things. I know when he goes in there, he's got an agent focus. Like he's going to go in and know what agents do and know the travails and the things that they have to deal with. And he's going to try to alleviate them and mitigate them and get more stuff and better regulatory things in place. He's just going to try to do better. ATF does a lot of stuff it probably shouldn't be doing because agents drive everything. And I think he's got enough of a focus and a 30,000 foot view now to say, okay, I'm not in that forest anymore. I can see all these trees, and I'm gonna sort of balance this out and make ATF into the Bureau it ought to be. That's my opinion. I mean, I've been very clear. I think he's probably the best thing that ATF could have happen to it in this administration. A permanently confirmed or a fully confirmed director with a president who chose him and an administration that supports the work of the Bureau. That's a first. Honestly, that's a first. So I don't think the rank and file I think the rank and file, frankly, after a year or so, are going to be just delighted to have David Chipman as the director. But we've got to get past all this hyperbole and nonsense first and get him in shape or installed.
So one thing I've been kind of curious about is like the ATF role in the background check system, because there's this myth that I've seen propagating around, and it involves multiple agencies, which kind of makes things complicated, where like we often hear the point that since it was like the national background check system was enacted in the 90s, there have been like 3.5 or 4.5 million people who have been denied access to firearms because they failed the background check. And yet each year we only see like 10 to 20 people actually be prosecuted at a federal level in some fashion for failing a background check. And lying on the background check form is supposed to have a severe criminal penalty with it. But so oftentimes it's not prosecuted at all, or like even referred, it seems. And so there's this myth that's come about that, well, because none of these are actually ending up being prosecuted, they're all false positives or false denials, meaning like somebody just happened to share the name with somebody who's a prohibited purchaser. And so 99% of background check denials are errors, which contradicts the FBI's own internal data, as well as the Office of Inspector General, which finds these denials have an accuracy rate of like 99.8%.
Right.
So it's a complete myth. I've written about it on GVPedia. You can find it in the Facts About Firearm Policy Initiative project. But it does lead the question, like, what's going on with so few prosecutions here when you have so many criminal violations that could be very dangerous, where you have somebody who should not be getting a firearm trying to access one, and in some cases getting it. And now when they get the firearm, I've heard that the ATF is actually very good at retrieving those firearms from the person who got them and shouldn't have. But much beyond that, it doesn't seem like much happens. So could you shed some light on that kind of situation there?
Yeah, what it really comes down to is the federal court system, in all honesty. The lie, it's 18 United States Code 1001 is making a false statement in the acquisition of, making a false statement. In our case, it's in the acquisition of a firearm. That's a 5-year federal felony. If you're convicted of it, you face the potential of 5 years. What really occurs, however, is that violation is not a desirable violation for the United States attorneys to indict and prosecute, because the federal court system is really pretty small, comparatively speaking. And those sort of it's really, I hate to say this out loud, but that's a low-level violation by the federal government considers it a low-level violation, lying on a form. Did you ever hear the phrase, "Don't make a federal case out of it"? My mom used to say that to me, "Mark, don't make a federal case out of that." Well, there's a reason for that. When you take a case into federal court, it's much more rigid. It's much more prescribed how things go than it is in any state or county court. So the U.S. attorneys see these violations, and they typically recognize them for what they are, as a paperwork violation. And unless it's part of a bigger scheme, which of course they all are part of a bigger scheme, they're not going to prosecute it. So what has to happen for them to be prosecuted is basically the agent would have to bring in a conspiracy case to traffic firearms. There is, though, as we've talked about, I think we haven't talked about it here yet, but we might. There's no federal firearms trafficking law. There's no anti-firearms trafficking law specifically. So the agents have to work up a federal conspiracy case, which is more complex to put together. It's a reality of that kind of work. The judges don't want to have their dockets crowded with low-level 5-year felonies when they can have Bernie Madoff and things like that. I mean, a little bit of hyperbole there, but that's sort of the bottom line. The federal government's prosecution is super powerful. I mean, Christ, in the 20 years, well, the 10 years that I actually did criminal work, I had 4 trials. I had something like a 98% plea rate, because people don't go to trial in the federal government, because you bring these beautifully constructed cases that are pretty airtight. You put people in, you offer to put people in jail, and you try to work your way up the ladder to something. So in my mind, as a working agent, what I would do with a straw purchaser is flip them, make them an informant, offer them to maybe take a plea to an aiding and abetting count in a conspiracy case, or a complete walk as a straw purchaser, but they have to testify against the person they bought the gun for. The federal system doesn't lend itself to the volume of prosecutions that you were talking about on straw purchasing. A solution would be to bring those false statement cases into state court and have straw purchasers. If there's a felony state violation for lying on an official form, which many states will have that. So that's an option for folks to do, but it's just not pursued real well. And the whole idea that you're talking about, that these are false positives, I mean, I know your ubiquitous foe, John Lott, is the main progenitor. He pushes that crap, and he's a liar, and we know he's a liar. And I would look him in the eye. In fact, I've texted with him and told him he's a liar, just as you have. He's propagated that myth, and it's that old thing about say a lie enough times and people start to believe it, and that's how he makes his money, is just continuing to go and make up nonsense and then wait for people like you to shut him down. So I guess my very loquacious answer is it's nonsense. They're good violations, but the federal court system isn't interested in prosecuting. I don't care what the U.S. attorney in a district says, we're going to prosecute these cases. He knows that if he loads his judges, his MAG judges and his district court judges up with those kind of cases, he's gonna get his butt handed to him. They'll ask him why. So is that a graspable? I know I'm in the weeds with a lot of this stuff because there's a lot more subtlety to many of these issues than the gun people would like to let on.
Yeah, and if people are interested, I believe Virginia is a point of contact state where those sort of violations are directed right to state authorities, and their prosecution rate is substantially higher.
Yes.
And so there's actually consequences for relying on these forms and trying to get firearms that you shouldn't have. Two last questions. One, you mentioned the gun trafficking law. So why is there not really a federal gun trafficking law, and is one actually necessary to actually help combat gun violence?
I don't know why there isn't one. I can only suppose that it's because of industry pressure not to have one, that they recognize that would endanger many of their enthusiasts. You just go on Gun Broker or Auction Arms and look at the number of likes some of those people have. They're dealing without a license. They don't. I think. Wow, Devin. I don't think it's necessarily necessary to have a firearms trafficking statute. Take this for an example. Congress takes up the lying buying, the 18 U.S.C. 1001, and adds a codicil to it that says, if the false statements in the acquisition of a firearm, the penalty is tripled, and the fine is tripled, something like that, and make it a serious violation that we as a country take seriously. We take it seriously that if you're lying about acquiring a firearm and you're going to give it to someone else, that's serious, and we think that's important. Right now, as a country, we don't think that's important because look what the law does. So we could fix this pretty simply by just doing what they've done to the 922, all the gun statutes, and just keep adding 922 G1, 922 N3. Keep doing that. That's a fix. To me, it's a Band-Aid. I think an anti-firearms trafficking statute would be super useful for ATF, because then they could start to put together some more complex conspiracy cases on this things with a trafficking statute that actually supported the elements that they currently prove. This is, again, I'm going in the weeds on the investigative stuff, but there's certain things you have to prove to prove up a violation, to support that you think that Devin Hughes committed this crime. And if you had the right law with the right elements set forth in it, it'd be pretty straightforward. So we don't have that law. It would be useful. It flies in the face of we don't need any new laws on the books argument that the NRA folks have, based on the fact that we don't prosecute straw purchasers. That's why they say that, right? Is we're not prosecuting all these however many people we have in our hand every year that we know lied and tried to buy. So why do we want a new law? Well, it would be helpful to the bureau that does these enforcement things to have a tool to be able to put together the cases they need to put together instead of having to cobble together different statutes and figure out which violation this behavior fits in.
Cool. So we have 2 minutes left. One final question real quickly that I saw in the chat. So when a dealer, what do you think a dealer is up to when they go like, oh, I've lost this firearm or several hundred firearms like in Arkansas? Is it just like they're bad at keeping the books, or most likely something nefarious and they're just saying, oh, we lost it, because that's preferable to saying, hey, we sold it out back to somebody?
Well, based on the inspection reports I've read, they wouldn't have really been in any danger, I don't think, if they had just admitted it, and they could have gotten a warning conference out of the deal. I think in that case, it's a very clear, nefarious, malevolent, evil plan to take a bunch of guns and move them out. I can tell you with great certainty that many dealers in this country don't have the slightest idea how to actually do business. They don't have business degrees. They opened the business because it's a hobby. They have lousy inventory practices, lousy employment practices, crappy security on their place of business, whether it's a store or a home. It isn't entirely their fault. Many of them, they don't mean to do anything wrong, but they've never actually seen someone from ATF to hand them the best practices guide and say, this is what you ought to be doing to run your business the right way. It's also, it's a problem because ATF can only inspect a dealer, any dealer, once a year. So it would be really helpful if they found a dealer that was making all these mistakes, and they went in and helped them correct them, which is part of their job, and then were able to come back kind of regularly to see if they were actually doing it. But you find a problem, you get a year to come back. It's an untenable arrangement for that. That's why the Illinois arrangement is so good. The state police, when they find a problem, if it isn't criminal, it's administrative or just incompetent, they can help straighten it out, or they can move to revoke the license if they can't straighten it out in a relatively short period of time. That's part of ATF's problem, is they just have these expanded timeframes to be able to see things. They can't go back often enough to see stuff. So yeah, I think it's largely just many of them don't know what the heck they're doing and don't have the experience to show that. So
perfect. On that note, thank you so much, and I'll turn it back over to Caitlin for final.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. This has been enlightening and fascinating. So much to learn, and to have direct access to you to be able to ask these questions. We had some great questions from people from before the event, and then who submitted questions while it was going on. So this has certainly been a very well spent 60 minutes. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to do this for us. And what I will do is send an email to everyone here with a link to this recording. And if there are other questions that come up and you want to filter them through me and Devin, maybe we can pass them along to Mark. Yeah, this has been great. So especially right now with everything that's going on with the confirmation, hopefully we can get David Shipman in there, like you said, and see if we can make some real progress. So again, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. I will send that link out to everyone within a day or so, and just keep your eye out. We're going to keep doing our GVPedia Explains and GVPedia Explores. And we hope you're all enjoying your summer and being safe, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you so much.